Last time, we established that the seeds of World War II were sown in the humiliation and the debt of the Treaty of Versailles. The fire was lit in 1919. Now, just 20 years later, that fire explodes across Europe. We are in May 1940. The world is watching in utter disbelief as the combined might of France and the British Expeditionary Force, the largest armies in Europe, are not just defeated, but utterly crushed in a matter of weeks. The operation was named Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, and its terrifying success was due to one simple revolutionary concept: Blitzkrieg. Forget the stagnant 4-year nightmare of trench warfare that defined World War I. That was the war of the defense, where the machine gun and barbed wire ruled, and every advance was measured in yards of mud and blood. The Allied commanders were still preparing to fight that war. They relied on static defense, believing their immense border fortresses and their huge numbers of infantry would stop any German advance. But the Germans had invented a new kind of terror, a war of movement, speed, and absolute shock. Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, wasn't just fast, it was a perfect synchronization of 3 deadly elements: air power, armored power, and radio communication. First, the Luftwaffe, Hitler's illegally rebuilt air force. They weren't just bombing cities, they were acting as flying artillery, clearing the path immediately ahead of the tanks. The infamous Stukas dive bombers screamed from the sky, their sirens, the Jericho trumpet, designed purely for psychological terror, paralyzing the enemy troops before they even saw a German boot. Second, the Panzer divisions. Tanks were no longer lumbering infantry support. Under commanders like Heinz Guderian, the Panzerwaffe was organized into independent, mobile divisions, designed not to hold ground, but to penetrate, bypass, and sever the enemy's lines of communication. They were the spearhead. Third, radio communication. This was the silent killer. Unlike the Allies, where tank and air commanders relied on flags or runners, the Germans equipped their armored spearheads with radios. This meant a panzer commander could instantly coordinate with the Stuka pilot overhead, or with the division commander miles behind, allowing for immediate exploitation of enemy weakness, a fluidity the Allies simply could not match. The Allies, meanwhile, were fighting on a timetable that was 25 years old. The French had the Maginot Line, a massive concrete defense system, but it ran only along the border with Germany. They believed the only way the Germans could invade was through the flat plains of Belgium, just like in 1914. This was the trap. The Allied plan, the Dial plan, was to rush their best, most elite armies, the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, and the strongest French divisions, north into Belgium to meet the German advance head-on. They were driving straight into a calculated feint. On May 10, 1940, Hitler unleashed his forces. The attack had 2 parts. Army Group B, a large, strong force, smashed into the Low Countries, Belgium and the Netherlands. This was the lure. The Allies immediately rushed north, exactly as the Germans predicted. But the real deadly hammer blow came from Army Group A, led by the brilliant General Erich von Manstein and commanded on the ground by Guderian. This force consisted of the fastest, most concentrated panzer divisions, and they did the unthinkable. They drove straight through the Ardennes Forest. The Allies considered the Ardennes impassable to tanks because of its rough terrain and dense trees. It was the strategic equivalent of leaving the back door unlocked. Guderian's tanks poured through the forest, emerging on May 13th at Sedan, the weak hinge between the Allied forces in the north and the remaining French armies in the south. This wasn't just a breakthrough, it was a complete collapse of the Allied center. The Panzers, moving at speeds up to 50 miles a day, raced westward to the sea, ignoring all orders to stop and consolidate. Their objective was not Paris, but the English Channel. By May 20th, just 10 days after the invasion began, Guderian's tanks reached the coast at Abbeville. In a stunning strategic maneuver, the German armored forces had driven a deep, narrow wedge straight through France, completely cutting off the entire Allied force, the BEF, and the best French and Belgian divisions, in a vast pocket stretching from Dunkirk down to the south. The Allied high command was in chaos. Their communication lines were severed, their armies were surrounded, and their commanders were still issuing orders based on a static 1918 war. The trapped armies, totaling over 400,000 men, faced a terrifying prospect: surrender or total annihilation. The fate of the entire war, possibly the fate of Great Britain, hung over that single, shrinking coastal pocket. And that brings us to the moment of ultimate paradox, the Halt Order, the moment that defines the true miracle of Dunkirk. By May 24, 1940, the German forces were positioned perfectly. Guderian's panzers were lined up just 10 miles from the perimeter of Dunkirk, ready to sweep across the remaining low-lying ground and crush the trapped armies against the sea. The Allies were completely spent. The BEF had lost most of its equipment, and its morale was shattered. It was, militarily, a foregone conclusion. The Panzers could have finished the job in a single afternoon. Total victory, capturing the entire British fighting force, would have almost certainly forced Britain out of the war and prevented D-Day before it was even conceived. But then, the most bizarre, controversial, and decisive order of the entire Western campaign came down the line from Hitler's headquarters. Stop. General Guderian, the man who had executed the lightning-fast breakthrough, was furious. He was standing on the edge of complete victory, only to be told to wait. The Halt Order lasted for 3 crucial days: May 24th, 25th, and 26th. Why did Hitler, the man who craved total crushing victory, issue the most consequential tactical retreat in his entire military career? Historians have debated this single decision ever since, and the answer is a complex mix of inter-service rivalry, overconfidence, and Hitler's own strange political ambitions. The first reason was Göring's ego. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, was intensely jealous of the army and the success of the Panzer generals. He personally assured Hitler that his air force could finish the job. He promised that the Luftwaffe could annihilate the trapped Allied soldiers in the Dunkirk pocket without wasting the valuable tank fuel and armor. Hitler, always eager to promote the glory of his air force over the traditional army, agreed. The second and more complex reason was Manstein's fear of counterattack. Manstein and other commanders were worried. They had pushed the tanks deep into French territory, creating a long, narrow salient, and they worried about Allied counterattacks, severing the panzer divisions from their supply lines and infantry support. They argued the tanks were too valuable to risk in the marshy, low-lying ground around Dunkirk, where they could easily become bogged down or be attacked by the Allied navy. They reasoned it was better to save the panzers for the second phase of the invasion, the push south into the rest of France. But the third and most chilling reason was Hitler's political ambition. Hitler believed Britain was a natural ally for Germany, linked by race and culture. He famously told his generals he saw no reason to destroy the British army. He hoped that by simply crushing France and allowing the British soldiers to escape without their equipment, Britain would see the futility of the war and negotiate a favorable peace treaty, leaving him free to pursue his ultimate goal in the East, the invasion of the Soviet Union. He wanted to offer them a gesture of goodwill. So, for 3 critical days, the German panzers halted. They dug in and waited, while the Luftwaffe futilely tried to bomb the pocket. And in those 3 days, the real miracle began. This was Operation Dynamo, the legendary evacuation of Dunkirk. The British Admiralty activated its emergency plan. They realized the Royal Navy alone could not evacuate the masses of men fast enough. They put out a desperate call: "Send every available craft." And Britain answered. From May 26th to June 4th, over 850 vessels, destroyers, ferries, barges, fishing trawlers, pleasure yachts, paddle steamers, the legendary little ships of Dunkirk, crossed the Channel. The harbour at Dunkirk had been destroyed by bombing. The men couldn't use the quays. Instead, they lined up on the vast, sandy beaches, wading out shoulder-deep in the water, waiting to be rescued. The destroyers couldn't approach the shallow water, so the little ships, manned by civilian volunteers, fishermen, and off-duty servicemen, ferried the exhausted soldiers from the beaches to the larger vessels waiting offshore. It was a logistical nightmare and a tactical death trap. The men were under constant fire from the Luftwaffe, who finally realized their mistake, and the German artillery. Yet, The evacuation continued day and night in the smoke and the sea mist. The total expected rescue number was 45,000. It was a staggering failure if you looked at the scale of the defeat, but it was an unbelievable success given the odds. When the final ships left the beaches on June 4th, the total number of Allied soldiers evacuated was 338,226 men. That is the single most important number of the entire early war. The BEF had lost nearly all of its heavy equipment, 2,500 guns, 65,000 vehicles, and mountains of supplies were left on the beaches. They were saved, but Britain was defenseless. However, they had saved the men, and that is the real miracle. Winston Churchill, the new Prime Minister, addressed Parliament with a sober warning, calling the rescue a miracle of deliverance, but adding, "Wars are not won by evacuations." The rescue of the BEF meant that Britain still had a core of trained fighting soldiers, the seeds of the army that would eventually fight in North Africa, Italy, and return on D-Day 4 years later. If the Panzers had finished the job, those 338,000 men would have been prisoners, and Britain's ability to resist the inevitable German invasion would have been crippled. The consequences of Hitler's Halt Order were immediate and immense. Britain stayed in the fight. The rescue provided the psychological and military capital necessary for Britain to reject any notion of a negotiated peace, strengthening Churchill's resolve and allowing the war to continue. Hitler's trust in Göring eroded. The failure of the Luftwaffe to wipe out the pocket was a massive blow to Göring's credibility, beginning the long slide in Hitler's trust for his high command. The rise of the myth. Dunkirk became the ultimate propaganda victory for the British, turning a catastrophic military defeat into a powerful, morale-boosting narrative of resistance and national unity. The Blitzkrieg had utterly crushed the Western Front in 6 weeks, forcing the surrender of France. But the Halt Order at Dunkirk was the single strategic error that kept the door open for the Allied victory 4 years later. The man who orchestrated the war's most brilliant opening move ultimately made its most fatal early mistake, fueled by arrogance and a misplaced desire for a political peace. The victory over France was absolute, leading to the creation of the collaborationist Vichy regime, but the escape from Dunkirk meant that Britain, alone, now faced the full fury of the Nazi war machine. Next time, we look at what happened immediately after Dunkirk, the great defining clash of air power that saved Britain from invasion, the Battle of Britain. We'll explore the technology, the pilots, and the moment a small island nation stared down the greatest military threat the world had ever seen and refused to blink. Click here to subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive. And tell me below, if you were Hitler, would you have allowed the Panzers to keep driving, or was the Halt Order necessary to prepare for the push into the rest of France? Thank me for watching.